Hey everyone, it's certainly a scary and interesting time in the world right now, and I wanted to take a minute and talk about something that gets my mind off things in the outside world and makes me feel happy. It makes me feel like I did when I was a kid, and that's video games, and specifically retro video games. And I, for one, think that right now in 2020, we're living in a golden age for retro gaming. Possibly one of the best times to ever get into retro gaming. You want to know why? Check out in the rest of this video as we find out if 2020 is the perfect time to get into retro gaming. So like I said in the opening, is 2020 the perfect time to get into retro video gaming? And the short answer is yes. And that's it. Alright, let's roll the credits, move on with this. Oh, okay, so you want an explanation. I guess I can give that to you right now, too. Well, the long answer is, realistically, we've never had more options to actually play and enjoy retro games. First off, let's talk to the people that are the collectors, people that actually have the official games. Well, you're in luck because there's never been so many options with hardware. If you're like me, CRT is definitely the way to go when you're playing retro games, especially on older consoles, because they just don't seem to work with the newer televisions, not properly. But if you're also like me, CRT is a very big space investment in your home, specifically if you don't really have a lot of rooms. Like, I just had kids, so I don't really have room for a huge CRT here anymore. So you have to play on modern flat screen televisions. Luckily, there's tons of options for doing so. Number one is you can have your consoles modded. A lot of the older consoles right now are easily fixable with an RGB mod. Like, for example, I have a top-loading NES, and that top-loading NES, I brought it to my friend Anthony Griffiths, and he actually did a modification on it and hooked it up so I could plug an original composite cable into, the Nintendo one from the Super Nintendo, into the back of my NES top loader. And the great thing about that is, not only does it work through composite now, but it also gets rid of the jail bars, which I'm sure anybody who's had a top loader and hooked it up through RF knows what I'm talking about. But you can even go further than that, and you can get RGB mods, and most of the older flat screen TVs still accept those component connections, so you can do that. You can also buy cables. There's places out there like Castlemania Games, and they sell all kinds of excellent component cables to really get your console up to the most sharpest image that it possibly can. Then there's other adapters you can buy. I mean, the Cadillac of all these adapters is the FrameMeister. The FrameMeister is excellent, but really to get the best picture, you're still going to need to do an RGB mod. There's the open source scan converter. Really, if you want to learn about any of those options, you want to check out My Life in Gaming. They do the most comprehensive and best coverage of those devices to find out what's the absolute best way you can get your original hardware to look great on modern flat screen televisions. There's also something else called a RetroTink. Now, I have the original RetroTink, and while I don't find it does much of a job of actually up-converting the picture, what it does do is cut down on some of the latency involved with converting your, composite signal into your new flat screen TV and making sure that the timing is really good. So the RetroTink is a really cool option. There's a newer RetroTink coming out right now, and the RetroTink version 2, I don't know a lot about that, so you might want to check out that. There's a guy by the name of Mike G, does an excellent job. Again, go back to Castlemania Games. That seems to be the best place to order those. So, there's all these options if you want to play on original hardware. So what if you have the original hardware, but you don't have all the games, you only have some of the games? Well, if you're of low moral character, and I'm going to admit I'm like that too, you can also buy what's called a flash cart to go on your original consoles. So the way a flash cart works is, it actually comes, I've got one here that I bought from Stone Age Gamer. It's from Kriz Laboratories, the EverDrive N8. This is actually a fantastic device. I've managed to load every single North American and some Japanese games onto this, and everything works beautifully. So if you are determined to play on original hardware, but you want to emulate your games because you want to play some of those more expensive titles that are harder to get, this is certainly an option for that. And they do come in every system. You can buy one for the N64, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, everything you can think of. The great thing about these, they also work in the analog system. So like the Analogue NT, the Mega SG, and the Super NT. The flash cards actually work in those devices. So that's a great option for doing that. That's if you want to move away from original hardware. So what if you have all the games and you don't want to modify your systems, you don't have the money to buy all these extra devices like a FrameMeister, RetroTink, and you don't have the money, $500 to shell it to get an Analogue NT? Well, there are other options. One, of course, is the Retron 5. Retron 5 is what a lot of YouTubers used recently because it was so easy to take your original hardware game, plug it into the Retron, which took a multitude of systems, and what it actually does is this pseudo emulation. So even though you have your original card in, it's still emulation, but it looks fantastic. So a lot of YouTubers are using that for a long time. The Retron is really cool also because it allows you to plug in your original controller. So you can take an original NES controller, plug it in, and even though you're playing an emulated game through this system, the actual cartridge is in there, so you still own it, so you don't feel bad about emulation, and you're using the original controller. So that's a really, really cool option as well. Well, since we brought up the elephant in the room, emulation, might as well talk about that, because you might be the kind of person that, you just don't have the money to get in all this retro gaming. Even though it's gone down a little bit right now, it's not as rampant as it once was, so it's not as popular. Retro gaming can still be very expensive, not just the systems, but the games too. So if you're of low moral character, and like I mentioned earlier, I kind of am too, you can also emulate. And there's so many different ways to emulate. Of course, there's the easy one that everybody does. You can emulate right on a computer. You can use a program called RetroArch. That seems to be one of the most popular ones, and emulate right on your regular PC. But if you're like me, I like playing on a TV. I don't want to be sitting at a computer. That's just not who I am. But there's a lot of options for that as well. I'll take back to my first experience with console emulation, because I know you can do it with an Xbox, but the one I first remember is the Dreamcast. That system, which was a detriment to it, you could actually hack your Dreamcast, and I remember having so many NES and Super Nintendo games all on like a disc that I would put in and play through my Dreamcast, and it was cool, but it never really felt right. Move forward to today, and there's just so many options I've even used. I mean, there's options for modded Wiis. Like, I use my modded Wii a lot. The only detriment to that is you have to use the classic controller, so there's been times I've been right in the middle of a game, and all of a sudden my controller batteries would die, so that kind of sucks. But the Wii actually does do a very, very good job of emulating most of the older games. My favorite option right now is actually my Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi, the picture looks fantastic on it, it runs mostly everything, and it's really cheap and efficient to use. The other cool thing about the Raspberry Pi, which I add to it then, is the controllers I'm using. I'm using controllers from 8BitDo, and if you take a look at these things, they're just great to use. They used to have a square NES type controller that had 4 buttons, and that was a cool option, but they don't really sell that one anymore. So now they have the NES 30 Pro, which still has the design of the original NES controller and the 4 buttons, but it's a very thin controller. Buttons on it are a little bit small, but the directional pad is pretty much perfect. That's an option. Not everybody likes that one. I've been using it a lot. They also have the I think it's just SN30 Pro, which is actually just a really thick and enjoyable Super Nintendo controller. So if you're going to go with a Raspberry Pi, I suggest looking at 8BitDo's controllers. They're a great option. Cool thing is you can also buy receivers and have them hook up to your mini consoles. There's also official emulation on consoles already existing. You look at the Wii, for example, is probably the biggest reason I got back into retro gaming. Because the Wii Virtual Console, I went back and bought so many classic Nintendo games, Super Nintendo games, Sega Genesis, and TurboGrafx-16. Oh, it reignited my love with the TurboGrafx-16. The fact that you could just go and get all these games on this console
really got me interested in retro gaming again, and it's what's rekindled my passion, had me go up to my parents' house, get all my retro games back, start going to flea markets and looking for more. So, you know, you've got that option. Unfortunately, the Wii Virtual Console shop is closed down now, so you can't buy any more games. However, we have the next best alternative for anybody who has a Switch. If you have the Wii, online service, you get the NES library that they have up there for free. You get the Super Nintendo library, and fingers crossed we're going to get N64 pretty soon. So, I mean, this stuff is super accessible for everybody to reach out and grab. So, if you have a Switch and you're already paying for online, go try out some original games. They're right there. It's so easy and it's free with the service. And, you know, if you've got an old Wii sitting around and you've downloaded some games, you can go back and play them on those. I mean, they look better on the Switch, honestly. The Wii doesn't translate 100% to modern TVs, so maybe try it on the Switch, but, you know, there's options out there. So we also have official emulation. About 2.5 years ago, there was a huge craze when Nintendo announced the Nintendo Classic Edition. And what this was a little tiny mini console that was shaped just like the original NES and came prepackaged with 30 official games, and everybody went nuts. They were in limited supply. I remember that I didn't pre-order one, and I ended up having to go to EB Games and wait in line for like 6 hours because a shipment had supposedly come in before I finally got one. It was a huge craze, and everybody made the comment like, oh, just get a Raspberry Pi. That was frustrating because it's not about playing the games, it's about collecting the little thing, and anybody a video game collector, you know you wanted to have one of these things. So the NES Classic came out, and mini consoles weren't a new concept. Companies like At Games and other people have been doing them for years, but this is the first time it was really done officially by the same company. Well, scratch that. Not officially the first time it was done by the same company. There was a Neo Geo remake made a couple of years ago, which I bought as well, the Neo Geo Gold. But what that actually was a handheld Neo Geo that you could also then plug in to a dock, and it was shaped like the original Neo Geo system, even came with the original controller. So, I mean, looking back on it when I bought it, I was like, oh, it's kind of lame. But now I just think about it and I'm like, man, I have a Neo Geo. You know, if you've taken a look at Neo Geo collecting, I mean, these things are massively expensive. Like, to get the system, and then the games are super expensive. So the fact that I just have this little thing now, even though it's not perfect, and you know, I'm not in love with the fact that it goes forces full screen, so you actually have to change your TV to 4:3 to play in the correct aspect ratio. It's just cool that I have this option to play Neo Geo games on my TV now. So we'll go back to the NES Classic. So this was really, after the Neo Geo, the first iteration that came out from the official company. And you know what? Fantastic. I absolutely loved it, and I was so excited that the minute the Super Nintendo Classic was announced, I went out and bought those. This was then followed up by the Sega Genesis Classic, which just recently came out. Before that was the PlayStation Classic, which I still had a lot of fun with, but definitely of the classic systems released so far officially from the companies, that's probably the worst one. They did a really piss poor job with that, and I could get into a long video talking about game selection, other things. It just, whatever reason, they just didn't go all in like Nintendo did. Nintendo did an excellent job of making sure they had everything there. So did Sega. The Sega Genesis Classic, or I think it's called the Sega Genesis Mini. If you haven't picked up one yet and you can see one on sale, go get it, because man, they do such a good job of emulating what the experience was like playing on the original Genesis, and it just looks so good on modern TVs. Now, the other cool thing with these mini consoles is you can actually hack them and mod them as well. So if you're not the kind of guy that wants to go fooling around with a Raspberry Pi, you can actually go online. There's services like HackChi where you can basically get into the system, erase the core, I think it's called, and then load it up with as many games as you want. Me, I'm the kind of person who likes to keep everything stocked, so I foolishly went out and bought a second SNES Classic, a second PlayStation Classic, and a second SNES Classic, and added the extra games I wanted to on the second one. And you know what? I don't ever even use them. They're in a closet somewhere, and I'm just content playing with this mini console. I mean, you look at the NES Classic, it's got 30 games. Like, sure, there's games I'd love to have on it, but you have a whole library of what a normal person would have if they went to their parents' house and got their old NES out in this one little package, and it's just such a perfect little experience. What about other options for retro gaming? How about arcades? I mean, growing up, walking into an arcade was one of the coolest experiences I ever had, and I never in my life dreamed I would have my own arcade. And of course, you know, there are people out there that collect arcades, but there's risks associated with that. I mean, you get an arcade home, you have to know how to work with it. It can be dangerous because sometimes the monitor, the electricity inside is not decharged. You can electrocute yourself. You've got to be good at soldering circuitry, making sure TVs are hooked up. It's a massive headache. So on top of the fact that arcades are hard to find, they can be expensive, and it can be a nightmare of trying to fix these things up, it's not something you would expect that you could have in your house. Lo and behold, here comes Arcade 1-Up, my beloved Arcade 1-Up. And they make it so easy for you to go out and pick up this, 3/4 size version of an arcade cabinet to bring and put in your home. It has the original artwork, and really, it's the same experience. So I walk around the corner now, and there's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, sitting in my house. I remember being a kid and getting the NES game for Turtles and saying, well, this is the closest I'll ever get to having the arcade experience home. Fast forward, 30 years, here I am. I have an official Arcade 1-Up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade. I mean, there's just so many options for us to play retro games right now, and it's so accessible and so easy to do, whether you want to be an official collector and play on original hardware or mod your systems. I mean, whatever way you want to do it, just do it, because there's really, in my opinion, never been a better time and never been so many options to get into retro gaming. So anyways, guys, I hope you watched till the end of this video, and I hope you hear what I said, and if you're interested in retro gaming, but you've been scared for whatever reason to get into it, hopefully some of these options I gave you kept you interested. And most importantly, during this really horrible time in humanity, as we all go through this whole pandemic together, I hope this just got your mind off what's going around in the outside world, and maybe gave you an idea of something you could do to entertain yourself while we're all stuck inside and trying to make the best of it. Anyways, of course, I'm MichaelBtheGameGenie, guys. Stay safe, stay strong, we'll get through this. Most importantly, stay in and play some goddamn video games.